Right now, as you watch this, millions of people around the world are quietly walking away from religion. Not in protest, not in anger, just quietly, slowly, painfully. They were good people. They followed the rules. They prayed when they were told to pray. They gave when they were told to give. They stayed silent when silence was expected of them. They doubted in secret and believed in public. And they genuinely tried, to feel what everyone around them seemed to feel. And still, somehow, after all of that, they woke up one morning carrying something nobody told them religion was supposed to give them. Fear, shame, a permanent low-level anxiety that no amount of prayer seemed to quiet. So here is the question, the dangerous question, that most people are too afraid to ask out loud. What if the problem was never God? What if the real problem was what human beings built around him? Because the moment you separate those two things, God on one side and the human institution built in his name on the other, history starts revealing something deeply uncomfortable. Something that explains why so many intelligent, sincere, spiritually hungry people are leaving organized religion at a rate the world has never seen before, and still searching for something they cannot name. Tonight, we are going to investigate that something. We are going to go deep into the psychology of belief, the architecture of fear, the neuroscience of identity, and the ancient human need for meaning that sits at the center of all of it. And by the time this is over, you are going to see religion, spirituality, and your own belief system in a way you may never have considered before. Welcome to the Right Mindset. If you are new here, this channel exists for one reason: to help you understand the hidden systems shaping your thoughts, your identity, and your life. Subscribe if that is what you are looking for. And let us begin. Before we can talk about religion, we have to talk about something even more fundamental. We have to talk about why human beings needed it in the first place. Because the story of religion does not begin in a church or a mosque or a temple. It begins in the dark. Thousands of years ago, human beings lived in a world that made almost no sense to them. The sun disappeared every night, and they did not know if it would return. Children died from illnesses that had no explanation. Droughts came without warning. Storms destroyed everything in hours. Lightning split trees. Floods swallowed villages. And the human mind, this extraordinary, pattern-seeking, meaning-making machine, could not tolerate the silence. The psychologist Viktor Frankl spent years in a Nazi concentration camp, watching human beings survive the most unimaginable conditions. And what he discovered was staggering in its simplicity. It was not the strongest people who survived. It was not the most physically powerful. It was the people who could find meaning in what was happening to them. The people who could answer the question, why is this suffering not random? Frankl wrote that a human being can endure almost any suffering, as long as that suffering feels purposeful. That is not a religious statement. That is a psychological one. And it tells us everything about why religion was invented. Human beings cannot live without meaning the way they cannot live without oxygen. The search for it is not weakness. It is not superstition. It is not primitive thinking. It is one of the most fundamental drives the human brain possesses. Carl Jung, one of the most influential psychologists who ever lived, spent his entire career studying this. He argued that the unconscious mind naturally produces religious imagery, spiritual symbols, and mythological archetypes, not because someone told it to, but because the need for transcendence is wired into human psychology at a level beneath conscious thought. So the first thing we need to understand is this: religion did not create the human need for meaning. The human need for meaning created religion. And that distinction matters enormously, because it means that when religion fails people, and we're going to talk about exactly how and why that happens, it does not mean the need underneath it was wrong. The hunger is real. The question is whether the meal being served is actually feeding it. Now here is where it gets interesting. Because across every culture, every continent, every civilization in human history, the pattern is the same. Human beings experience something: a revelation, a vision, an insight, a moment of profound connection to something larger than themselves. They try to communicate it. They pass it to others. Those others build systems around it. And then, slowly, almost invisibly, something shifts. The experience that started everything becomes secondary. The system built around it becomes primary. And once a system becomes primary, a new goal enters the picture: survival. Not spiritual truth, not the original revelation. Survival. And once any human system begins protecting its own survival, truth is no longer the only priority. That is not a moral judgment. That is sociology. That is history. And it is the engine behind almost everything we are going to examine tonight. I want you to think about a child. We will call him Eli, not because it is anyone's real name, but because the story of Eli is the story of millions of people watching this right now. Eli grows up in a religious household, and from his earliest memory, God is not introduced to him as love. God is introduced to him as a test. Every mistake Eli makes, every time he loses his temper, every time he doubts, every time he feels confused or angry or resentful, there is a system ready to interpret that feeling as a spiritual failure. He learns to be afraid of his own thoughts. He learns that doubt is dangerous. He learns that questioning is disloyal. He learns that the correct response to anything uncomfortable is silence, prayer, and obedience. And here is what is devastating about that. Eli is not being taught to connect with God. Eli is being conditioned to manage the fear of God. And those are two entirely different things. One opens you, the other closes you. Now I want to be precise here, because this is important. What happened to Eli is not unique to any single religion. It has happened inside Christianity. It has happened inside Islam. It has happened inside Judaism, Hinduism, Buddhism. It has happened inside every major spiritual tradition in human history. And the reason it happens is not because those traditions are evil. The reason it happens is because of what institutions do to ideas. Think about what happens when a spiritual revelation, something raw, direct, and personal, gets handed to an institution. The institution needs to preserve it, so it writes it down. Then it needs to protect it, so it creates gatekeepers. Then it needs to grow, so it develops hierarchy. Then it needs to sustain the hierarchy, so it develops theology around authority. And at every single step of that process, the original experience moves one step further from the average believer. Until eventually, for someone like Eli, the spiritual life is not about encountering something transcendent. It is about performing obedience for the approval of people inside a system. The theologian Paul Tillich called this the Protestant principle. The idea that every religious institution is in permanent danger of replacing the sacred with itself, of becoming the thing it was meant to point toward. But you do not need to be a theologian to recognize this. You just have to look at history. Every major religious reformation in human history has followed the same pattern. People who were deeply, sincerely, passionately spiritual, looking at the institution built around their faith and saying, "This is not the same thing." What we were promised was a relationship with the divine. What we got was a performance for the institution. Martin Luther, nailing his theses to the church door, was not an atheist making an argument. He was a man of profound faith making a distinction between God and what had been built around God, between spirituality and institution. And that distinction, that same distinction, is what millions of people are quietly rediscovering right now in the 21st century. Not because they have lost faith, because they have finally found the courage to separate what they were given from what they were searching for. And that is the beginning of something. But before we get there, we need to talk about the mechanism that keeps people from making that separation for so long. We need to talk about fear. This is the part of the documentary that I want you to pay very close attention to. Because what we are about to discuss explains, at a neurological and psychological level, why so many people remain inside religious systems that are causing them significant harm, and why leaving, even when everything rational inside you is urging you to leave, can feel like dying. Here is the core insight. Fear creates stronger psychological conditioning than love. This is not a controversial statement in neuroscience. It is settled science. The amygdala, the part of your brain responsible for processing fear, has a direct and powerful connection to memory formation. Fearful experiences do not just get remembered, they get encoded. They get wired into the structure of who you believe you are. When a child grows up being told that their eternal soul is in danger if they think the wrong thoughts, that message does not get processed as theology. It gets processed as survival. And the survival system of the human brain does not distinguish between a lion and a theological concept. It responds to both the same way, with everything it has. Now here is where this becomes critical to understand. When fear gets attached to identity, when the belief system becomes inseparable from who you believe yourself to be, something extraordinary happens. Obedience starts to feel like morality. Silence starts to feel like loyalty. And questioning the system starts to feel like destroying yourself. This is not metaphor. This is neurology. The brain literally encodes the threat of questioning as existential danger. Not because the danger is real, but because the conditioning was deep enough and early enough to become identity. There is a concept in psychology called identity fusion. It describes what happens when an individual's sense of self becomes merged with a group or belief system, to the point where any threat to the group is experienced as a threat to the self. Research by social psychologist William Swan has shown that people in a state of identity fusion will sacrifice their own well-being, will endure significant personal harm, rather than separate themselves from the group, because the separation feels like psychological annihilation. Think about that. People would rather suffer inside a system that is hurting them than face the terror of existing outside it, because the system has become them. And now, I want you to understand what this means for religion specifically. The most powerful religious systems in history were not powerful because people feared God. They were powerful because people feared questioning God. And there is a profound and critical difference between those two things. A person who fears God, in the classical sense of awe, reverence, the recognition of something vastly greater than themselves, that person is spiritually awake. That fear is productive. It produces humility, wonder, moral seriousness. But a person who fears questioning the institution built around God, that person is not spiritually awake. That person is psychologically controlled. And the control does not feel like control. It feels like faith. That is the architecture. That is how it works. Fear gets attached to identity. Identity fusion makes leaving feel like dying. And the system gets to call all of it devotion. The most powerful systems are not the ones people fear. They are the ones people fear questioning. Because once fear fuses itself to identity, obedience starts feeling like morality. Silence starts feeling like loyalty. And eventually, people stop protecting truth and start protecting the system. That is when spirituality becomes architecture. And architecture always fights to survive. Now, I want to say something directly because I think it needs to be said. If you are watching this and recognizing yourself, if something in what I have just described is familiar to you from your own experience, I want you to know this. There is nothing wrong with you. The conditioning I just described is not the result of personal weakness. It is the result of deep, early, expertly delivered psychological programming. It happens to brilliant people. It happens to compassionate people. It happens to people with extraordinary spiritual sensitivity. The fact that you are watching this and recognizing it is not a sign of spiritual failure. It is the beginning of clarity. And that is what the right mindset is here for. If this conversation is something you want to continue, if you want to go deeper into the psychology of belief, identity, and how the mind creates the reality we live in, subscribe to this channel. This is what we do here, every single week. Because understanding the architecture is the first step to deciding what you actually want to build. Here is a question worth asking. If this has always been true, if the gap between spirituality and institution has always existed, why are we having this conversation now, in 2025, at a scale the world has never seen before? The answer is not simple, but one part of it is unmistakable. For the first time in human history, people can ask these questions without being alone. For most of human history, if you were born into a religious community and began experiencing doubt, your options were limited. The community was your social network. It was your family structure. It was your economic safety net. Leaving, even psychologically leaving, meant losing everything. The institution knew this, and the institution relied on it. But the internet changed the geometry of that trap. Suddenly, a person sitting alone in a religious household in a rural town could find, at 2 a.m, thousands of other people describing the exact experience they had been told was unique to their own sinfulness. They were not alone. They were not broken. They were not failing God. They were having a very normal human response to a very specific kind of psychological conditioning. And that discovery, that simple, shattering discovery, has been one of the most spiritually significant events of the 21st century. Not because the internet is sacred, but because connection dissolves shame. And shame, as we discussed, is one of the primary mechanisms by which institutional religion maintains control. But here is the other side of this. And this is important because this documentary is not an argument against faith. The same loneliness that is driving people out of religious institutions is driving a massive, global spiritual hunger. People are not leaving because they no longer need meaning. They are leaving because they need it more than ever. And the systems that were supposed to provide it have, for many people, stopped delivering. The rise of meditation, of mindfulness, of long-form philosophical content, of channels like this one, is not a coincidence. It is the sound of millions of human beings searching for what Viktor Frankl identified all those decades ago. Not religion, not an institution. Meaning. Direct, personal, unmediated meaning. And this is actually where the distinction we began with, between God and religion, becomes not just intellectually interesting, but practically urgent. Because if the hunger is real and the institution has failed to feed it, the question becomes, what comes next? I want to be careful here. I am not here to tell you what to believe. That is not what the right mindset is for. What I want to do is offer you a framework, a way of thinking about this. That may help you navigate your own answer to the question we started with. Religion, at its best, does something genuinely extraordinary. It preserves wisdom across generations. It creates communities of moral accountability. It gives people ritual. And ritual, despite being misunderstood by modern secular culture, serves a real psychological function. It marks time. It externalizes grief. It creates collective meaning in moments that are too large for individuals to carry alone. There is a reason that when people lose someone they love, they reach for ceremony. There is a reason that even people who identify as non-religious find themselves drawn to sacred spaces in moments of crisis. The impulse is not irrational. It is profoundly human. But here is what healthy religion requires. And here is where so many institutions have failed. It requires that the system remain the servant of the spiritual experience, not the master of it. The moment the institution becomes more important than the individual's direct experience of the sacred, something has gone wrong. The map has been mistaken for the territory. The finger pointing at the moon has become the object of worship itself. And the signal that this has happened is always the same. Fear begins replacing love as the primary motivator. Compliance begins replacing transformation as the primary goal. And the question, who does this serve, stops having a clear spiritual answer. Real faith, in whatever tradition, in whatever form, does not make you smaller. It does not silence your questions. It does not demand that you suppress your intelligence or your experience or your humanity in order to be accepted. Real faith, in the deepest sense of that word, should make you more conscious, more compassionate, more honest with yourself and with the world, more awake. Because if the point of a relationship with the divine is to connect you to something larger than yourself, then anything that consistently makes you smaller, more afraid, more silent, and more compliant is not serving that purpose. It is serving a different purpose entirely. And you are allowed to notice that. You are allowed to ask, what if God was never the voice making people afraid? What if the voice of the divine was always the quieter one? The one asking people to wake up, to love more precisely, to see more clearly, to extend more grace, to be more honest about what they actually believe and why. What if real spirituality was never about performing correctness for an institution? What if it was always about becoming more fully, honestly, courageously human? We started tonight with a dangerous question. What if the problem was never God? And I want to leave you with the deeper question underneath that one. If you grew up inside a religious system, or if you know someone who did, ask yourself honestly, what was the primary emotion that system produced? Not what it taught, not what it claimed, what it produced in the daily experience of the people inside it. Was it love? Was it wonder? Was it a growing sense of compassion and moral clarity? Or was it fear, shame, the permanent anxiety of being evaluated and found insufficient? Because a system can preserve wisdom, and a system can preserve fear. And from the outside, those two things can look almost identical. The difference only becomes clear when you look at what the people inside it become over time. Do they grow? Or do they shrink? Do they become more loving? Or more afraid? Do they develop a deeper relationship with truth? Or a more sophisticated skill at avoiding it? Those are the questions that matter. Not whether the institution is ancient, not whether it has beautiful architecture, not whether the people inside it are sincere. Sincerity inside a broken system does not make the system unbroken. It just makes the tragedy more complete. Maybe the greatest loss is not that people stopped believing in God. Maybe the greatest loss is that so many people were introduced to fear before they were introduced to love. And once fear becomes the filter, even truth becomes difficult to recognize. So I want to ask you, directly, personally, to answer this in the comments below. What was the moment you first realized there might be a difference between God and religion? Or maybe you believe they are inseparable. Either way, I genuinely want to hear your perspective. Because nobody grows in silence. And the conversation in the comments of this channel is one of the most honest I have encountered anywhere on the internet. Share this video with someone who has been quietly wrestling with these questions. Not to convince them of anything, just to let them know they are not alone in asking. If this conversation is what you are looking for, subscribe to The Right Mindset. Because this is what we do here. We go into the systems shaping human behavior, the psychology underneath the surface of the stories we tell ourselves, and the questions that actually matter. And we are only just getting started.